Hello everybody and welcome to a session on, as you can see, Brainy lesson planning and teacher-friendly and learning-friendly teaching. Before I begin properly, I would like to open with a little puzzle. A puzzle which I hope is not going to tax you very much. It is based on whether or not you are familiar with one of my favorite TV series for children, one that's no longer on air, sadly, the series called Sesame Street. Are you familiar with it? Hope you are. Well, if you are, then I hope you also remember that each episode of Sesame Street had a sponsor, either a letter or a number. And in my case, I've chosen a letter to be our letter of the day for the sake of this session. So as you can guess, my question to you is, can you think and decide which of the 24 letters of the English alphabet this could be? If you need, you can pause the recording for a second, and if you still can't think of which one it is, I'm going to give you a hint because I'm nice. Okay, so the hint is this one, and I'm guessing that when you look at the screen now, it's very easy, and of course it is the letter R. Now, of course, at this point you have no reason to see any kind of connection between this letter and the content of the session yet, but instead of telling you what the connection is, I have yet another little puzzle to do with the letter R. And believe you me, this one is going to be really easy, but at the same time I hope that you will start seeing something of interest when it comes to the letter R and the message that I would like to communicate to you in the course of today. What is this connection? Well, let's look at this question. The question is the following. Now, I hope that you've immediately noticed that something rather interesting is missing here, is it not? It is, of course, the letter R, or if you are precise, 2 R letters. Now that we have got the question in place, I wonder whether the question itself represents a real problem for you. Does it? Well, I hope it does, in the sense that as we otherwise know from other objective sources, including, for instance, the results of the recently published report, the report of the Central Examination Body on the outcome of the first ever 8th graders examination, we know that the students' population at large is not necessarily very good at this. At what? At remembering what we so painstakingly teach on a daily basis. And even though we keep engaging more and more advanced methods and tricks and use all sorts of diverse activities and very good materials, somehow at the end of the day they certainly remember less than we might want. The question, as always, is why? And to sort of get you in the mood, I would like to offer a little quiz for you to look at and decide between the 5 reasons that I am about to show you. So here is reason number 1. Maybe it is because they are like that. They are just malicious and they could easily remember, but they somehow don't. Or maybe it is reason number 2. Could that be a reason, maybe? Okay. Reason number 3, potentially. A good one, isn't it? I'm sure this rings a bell when it comes to your bad day. Reason number 4. Okay, and I'm sort of sensing less of a giggle on the other side of the screen now. We'll come to the reason why in a moment. And to complete the 5, here is the 5th. That's no doubt a favorite. Okay, now, out of these 5, I am guessing if we start being serious, we are going to say that the 2 important reasons why the remembering may not be as satisfactory as we would like are these 2, aren't they? Right. Now, here is a question I would like to ask you. What is the connection between those 2 reasons? Do you perhaps see any crucial words that should be highlighted of the 2 reasons? Now, I hope this is not too difficult, but at the same time, I also hope that you start gradually to see the reason why the sponsor of the day is indeed the letter R. Right? That's the reason, right? The 2 crucial words, understand and recycle, it so happens that both share the letter R. And if you are thinking, okay, well, is this just a coincidence? Well, notice if it is, it's rather a good one, isn't it? Because the word remember and the word understand and the word recycle all share the letter R. Are you getting a little intrigued? I hope you are, because there's a lot more coming up. Okay? Now, here is one of those extras, if you like. This picture perhaps is not very pretty, but it codes something very, very important for us as educators. You know what that is? Take a good look, and I hope that the magic word is going to spring to mind. The magic word surprise, surprise also contains our letter of the day, does it not? Well, yes, it does, because of course it's the word neurons. Okay, so what does this picture show? Well, it shows what happens to a human brain, and by human I mean everyone's brain, your children's and your own, between age 0 at birth, then the period between 0 and 7 years of age, during which, as you can see, the brain is getting denser and denser with every passing year. And then notice something rather incredible. Right, between ages of 7 and 15, suddenly the brain stops getting denser, and in fact we are getting fewer and fewer neuronal connections. Does this mean we are getting more stupid between the ages of 7 and 15? Well, of course not, but something rather important happens. By the way, I hope you've noticed that the beginning of this critical period is quite significant for us as educators, because at age 7, more or less, give and take 1 year, school happens, school begins, does it not? Okay, well, what does it tell us? Well, no, but I mean, seriously, this process that any human brain undergoes between the ages of 7 and 15 is not a process of getting more and more stupid. It's a profound process of the brain selecting what is useful and as such worth keeping and what is not. First, in the first 7 or so years of age, it keeps amassing information, but then it starts getting more selective, smarter if you like. Okay? Now, what does this have to do with anything? Well, notice that if you really take this seriously, there is a very important consequence for us as educators. What kind of consequence? Well, of course, the things that the brain is going to prune, another word with R, by the way, or remove, another word with R, are the things which are not useful enough for the brain. And how does the brain know which things are useful and which are not? Well, some of these things get used more often than others. And this is where the message comes for us. Because you see, from our perspective, it's quite obvious that unless something will get used, it will get lost. The familiar principle of use it or lose it applies here more than perhaps in any other situation. And you will appreciate that I struggled to insert an R even into this formulation in order to try and persuade you that something really interesting is at stake here. I am coming very close to my real message today, so, hold on tight. But before this happens, I have just one more puzzle for you. As you can see, I'm also quite fond of giving your brain a number of puzzles. Why is that? Because I am trying to engage you, of course, right? So the puzzle for you now is the following. The puzzle is, okay, if indeed brains overall remember less than we would like, and if our long-term objective is to make sure that the brain will not lose the precious information that we want it to keep, then how do we accomplish that? What is our raison d'être, as the French say? Actually 2 R's, but I highlighted one in the heading. And now something that I would like your brain with R to ponder a little, and it is, okay, so what is this strategy? What is the goal? Okay, this, if you pardon a bit of Polish, is a rebus, another word with R, a bit of word play, also contains the R inside it. And if you need a little help, I'm always ready and willing to help because I'm nice, you see. So the help is this. Okay, I hope it's a little easier. So what do we want? Well, we want the brain to do what? To remember better with the R, the mathematical symbol, more. I hope you've noticed that. This also contains the R, at least in writing or American English. And finally, so better, more, and the last one for longer, right? Not long, not longest, longer. All three conveniently also contain the letter R, at least at the end. Coincidence? Well, I think, as I said before, if it is, it's a rather good one. Now, in case you are thinking, I'm a little over the top here with all those R words, well, you see, it just so happens rather conveniently that methodology, English language teaching methodology, also has a label, a cover term for all of this, for the 10 minutes of my session today, okay? And the word is, surprise, surprise, one with the letter R, the word retention. So, to want students to remember is, in other words, trying for them to retain a lot more information than they otherwise do. At which point, I am sure a lot of you will say, well, we kind of know how to do this. In fact, if you are like me, you may still remember what your teachers used to say, and not only in the English language. If you ever came up to them and said, well, teacher, how do I study? How do I remember more? The answer that I was given, but this was an answer given last century, as I went to school last century, was, well, you just go home and study some more. So if you like, a bit of a joke, of course, but if you want students to remember more, classically, we would say, well, you just go home and you do a lot of recycling on your own. And if you want to do better, well, what do you do? Well, you do more recycling, you see? And I'm sure you've guessed what the third R, golden R, is going to be now. Well, if you want to do really well, then you just have to study some more. And as you see, this sounds like a reasonable plan, but as I already said, it was a plan and it was a strategy, a recipe that I was provided with last century. But you see, things have changed since then. We have grown smarter. We know a lot more science of learning based on which we can formulate our strategies and tips for the learner. So what have we learned? Well, we have learned that if a learner only engages in something which a great modern course book certainly provides, which is a, end of unit revision lesson, or sometimes every other unit revision lesson, like this one, for instance, then, of course, it's useful, but it is by far not enough. Why is it not enough? Because, if you pardon yet another R word for today, revising and recycling periodically only does not give the learner's brain enough room. You will appreciate that I am struggling to come up with yet another R word, but what I really mean is that the space within which revision and recycling happens is simply not dense enough. Shall I illustrate that for you? Well, it all boils down to something which in methodology is called, and seriously, the number of exposures. Exposures, opportunities to see and hear and do something with an item that a brain is trying to learn. It's quite profound, and in the next few minutes I would like to really explore this area of what it means to give a student a lot more exposures than perhaps otherwise he or she would be given. To substantiate this, I'm going to revisit this idea of room and ask you yet another of my rather silly puzzles, which is from the point of view of retention, which room is the most important for the learner? And I should add straight away that it just so happens that the most important room is not classroom. It is important, but really the most important room is different. It is the room called bathroom. And in case you are a little taken aback, why is the bathroom so important? Because you see, the bathroom contains this rather important object, this one, and this object has made quite a career, so as to speak, in recent vocabulary retention studies. People like Norbert Schmidt and others who've seriously looked at how much, when, and how is remembered have come up with this term that I would like to offer for your consideration now. This term is bathtub effects. What's a bathtub effect? Well, imagine yourself, a grown-up person in a bathtub. What is the situation then? What can we see? Well, we typically can see a head sticking up on one side and maybe feet and toes on the other. But the middle bit is literally and metaphorically sinking under the surface. This is precisely the effect that those vocabulary researchers have described when it comes to vocabulary retention. Unless, and this is crucial, unless you give the learner enough in way of number of exposures for the item to get lifted from underneath the surface and finally be ready in the brain for further manipulation. Now, at this point, you are probably wondering, okay, but is there any kind of specific help? How many times do we need to expose the learner to a vocabulary item? And my answer is, they've come up with a bracket, quite fascinating. Would you like to know? Well, the bracket is between 5 and 16 times minimum. 5 and 16 times minimum, you need to expose a learner to an item if you want to ensure that this item does not sink underneath, fly away from memory, pick your favorite metaphor. Now, at this point you might say, well, this is quite a wide bracket, isn't it? 5 to 16. Why is that so? Well, the answer is actually quite simple. Students are different. You probably have got a Marisha in your classroom, for instance. Who's Marisha? It does not have to be actually called Marisha, but I'm sure you have got one at least. It's a good student, the one who always knows first, gives you the answer, the correct one first, always has got her notebook ready, does not forget things, etc. But on the other hand, and at the other end of the spectrum, you may have got somebody who we might call Wojtuś. It's a very nice guy, except he probably still does not know what the heck I'm talking about, Wojtuś definitely needs more time and definitely needs a greater number of exposures, okay? And of course, Marysia can also have a weaker day, and Wojtuś potentially at least could have a slightly better day, you know. So it's a bracket. You really cannot say mathematically it's got to be 7 or 8 for everybody. But what is clear is that it has to be quite a few. Okay, now at this point you are probably saying, it's all very well, but you know, how did they know that? Well, I would like to refer you to something which I'm sure you have seen before, you know, the famous forgetting curve. It's a very depressing picture for education, one of the most depressing ones, really. What does it tell us? Well, it tells us that if we teach, okay, something once, then alas, it only takes a couple of hours for information to sink. You see, it's sinking underneath the surface again, all right? Now, it's not the only picture that they've come up with, thank goodness. There's an alternative. Look at this picture now. What does it show? Well, it shows the effect on memory, on retention, of a strategy where instead of just teaching something once and letting it sink, you teach and then you go back to it, okay? After a short while. Then, of course, it starts sinking again, but you can potentially lift it over the surface one more time with yet another opportunity for the student to revisit that item, and so on and so forth. In methodology, this strategy is called expanded rehearsal. Rehearsal, where for obvious reasons we are trying to retain the item over and over again. But why expanded? Well, as you can see, there is something rather interesting about this graph on my right, and it is the fact that those loops are getting wider and wider every second time, right? What does this mean? It means that the time that the brain needs between each rehearsal gets expanded, hence the word, okay? And this is quite nice, provided, of course, that the minimum number of exposures have been satisfied, okay? So, how do we prove this based on some realistic material? Well, I suggest to you that I will prove it to you by looking at page after page of a fantastic modern course book, but the main message that I would like to communicate to you for today will, of course, contain the R letter in my recommendation. And the message is we need a strategy called micro-recycling, not just a huge, you know, lump of recycling perhaps every unit or every 2 units, but recycling left, right and center within and a parcel of every single lesson. Let's take an example, shall we? Here is one. Imagine that you are working with a modern course book for 4th graders, you know, 10, 11-year-olds. They are in Unit 2, at the beginning of that unit, in fact, and they are being presented with the first vocabulary set of that unit. 8 items in total. Take a look. Have you? Okay, now what we are going to do is hide those 8 items and present your brain with a little challenge. Take a look. Of those 8 words you just looked at, and I hope you're not rewinding the recording now, because by the way, if you are rewinding, it means your brain needed an extra recycling session already. If you're not, try and face this challenge. Number 1, 2 przymiotniki zaczynające się na S. Can you recall, out of those 8 we just looked at, which 2 are these? Number 2, przymiotnik, który kończy się literą L. Are you able to find it yet? Okay, number 3, 4 przymiotniki, które kończą się literą Y. And finally, 2 przymiotniki, które zaczynają się tą samą głoską co wyraz kind. Now, what I'm guessing is happening is you are probably doing quite well, but let's face it too. Do not feel too good about yourself because you are a fluent speaker of English, right? This is an exercise for 4th graders, the ones who just began the serious study of English and who perhaps for the first time are looking seriously at a connection between the way the word sounds the way the word looks, its spelling versus its pronunciation, etc., etc., etc. So, what do they need? What does a typical student need in order to help the student retain more of this vocabulary? Well, I suggest to you that apart from the original exercise 1, where they were able to, for the first time, encounter these words, they will probably need, in order to fight the bathtub effect, they will need, that's the set, remember, they will need a whole series of micro-recycling events. Here is the first one. Posłuchaj nagrania, sprawdź swoje odpowiedzi do ćwiczenia pierwszego. You might say it's nothing, but it isn't, because you see, in the previous exercise, they had a chance to look at the words and maybe retrieve them, find them in a picture or locate them in a situation. Now they have a chance to filter them through the auditory channel. This leads into a bit of a phonics rap where, I'm guessing possibly for the first time, they are being confronted in a rather systematic way with the complex relationship between spelling and pronunciation in English, which in turn leads to this exercise, in which you might say, well, again, nothing particularly stunning, and yet spelling from the vantage point of not even egzamin ósmoklasisty, but in fact from the perspective of the upcoming new Matura exam, is proving to be a persistently difficult skill. I just had the chance to talk to those who are working on the new shape of the Matura exam, and the partial results of piloting studies suggest that as few as 40% of third graders in upper secondary school are capable of spelling a short, rather uncomplicated surname in English when they hear it in a piece of English recording. So this just shows me how important it is for the brain to retain this information for real. And what does the brain need? I hope you remember. Multiple exposures and micro recycling. Okay, so to move on a little further, we've looked at 4 exercises so far, and we've had 4 exposures to the target vocabulary set or its subset. And now I'm going to shoot just a little further in this lesson and present you with the following. Again, modestly looking activity. I'm going to play you just a little bit of the recording that accompanies this task. Have a listen.
What is 14 plus 5 plus 30 plus 19 plus 46?
It's 114.
Okay, now I hope you've noticed something rather interesting. What is it? Well, the obvious for any advanced speaker, and it is that, of course, neither the word clever nor the word sporty appears in the actual recording, which is a bit of a surprise to an uninitiated student, and something which, if you analyze the results of this year's egzamin ósmoklasisty, has proven, perhaps unsurprisingly, to be one of the key sources of difficulty. Students would be very happy to hear a word and copy it, but alas, in a lot of the tasks, they only hear the meaning of this word being rendered with a number of other words, very simple words sometimes. However, they need to interpret and put down the word that actually codes this particular meaning. Okay, so exercises like these are a chance to build, if you like, a micro skill that will no doubt be crucial when the day of the examination comes. Now, all of these exercises come from just one spread in the book. A sample spread I've taken from Unit 2. Why am I showing this to you? Well, because I want to persuade you that this is a strategy that cannot be based on just a certain number of clever exercises that are sort of scattered punctually around a book. They must be part and parcel of an effective book design. A student must and deserves, in fact, to be presented with this sort of organization on virtually every page. So what I would like to do and encourage you to do now is to try and review pages of Brainy in particular, this wonderful new course for early teenagers coming from Macmillan, from the perspective of just how well it does it. And I also challenge you to look at any other course book on the market, if you can, and see that this course really does a fantastic job of micro-recycling for the student. Now, in case you are not persuaded yet, I'm going to shoot, but not very far, just to the next spread, you know, the next 2 pages, which is a grammar spread. And I would like you to take a quick look at just one exercise from it, an opening exercise based on a piece of very, very small text. Of course, it's just the beginning of grade 4. And I want you to notice something rather interesting. Have you? Well, I hope you have. If you look at the few items underneath the text, I hope you've noticed that we have got as many as 4 references to the vocabulary, the target vocabulary set from the previous spread. Because you see, a crucial design feature of this particular course is that when you finish the first lesson, the first input lesson on vocabulary, and you are moving into the second lesson on grammar, then this new grammar is always based on the vocabulary introduced in lesson 1. And then lesson 1 and lesson 2 together feed into a third lesson, which is a skills lesson, where the new vocabulary and the new grammar can both be micro-recycled with a piece of further reading or listening. You see? So it's not a coincidence, it's a crucial design feature, micro-recycling. Now, how do we accomplish that? Well, I'm very, very proud to be able to present to you somebody very, very special. Somebody who I think has done a huge amount of good work for this course, and somebody who believes very firmly that this is the case. Take a look. As you look through this quotation, I hope that certain R words are immediately springing at you. Are they? You know, words like daily review, strengthen, previous learning, recall, and effortlessly. Super important words, not just because all happen to have the letter R in them, as you no doubt have seen, but also because they are in a sense telling us the positive end story of good teaching, right? Because if we really do our job well, then at the end of the day, the crucial vocabulary and grammar, something that we now call in the Polish methodology środki językowe, should indeed be ready for retrieval, yet another word, for instance, when the examination day comes, okay? Now on to that special person, remember, the one who certainly believes that. This is him, Tomasz Sztyber, somebody who you normally never hear of because he is the head editor behind this course. Why am I letting Tomek be publicly seen? Well, it is because, you see, he has got something rather magical on his computer. When he gets a piece of manuscript from his author, he does a bit of magic with this something magical, and he analyzes the number of occurrences of each of the key words that are part of the vocabulary sets of a given unit to find out whether they cross the important threshold level. Okay, so here is just 4 of these words, and I have got, I hope, a little surprise for you. The surprise is, how many times do you think the word sporty appears in Unit 2? Well, the answer is as many as 23 times, okay? Now, what about the word helpful? How many times does it appear? Well, the answer is as many times as 24. And fasten your seatbelts, it's getting better. The word shy appears as many as 30 times in Unit 2 only. And finally, the winner for this vocabulary set anyway, the word quiet, whose spelling is the most difficult, for instance, appears as many as 31 times. What does it show? It shows that someone is being really, really serious here. This is for 4th graders. But what if they get a little older, bigger? Call them what you will. I call them older. Are we going to change this methodology? Well, of course not. Remember that period between ages 7 and 15, when they are in grade 7, they are still very much in the midst of this pruning or removing process, right? The connections in the brain, remember, the ones which the brain decides are not useful enough are going to get removed. Okay? So we must continue, must we not? How do we do that? Well, let me give you yet another wonderful example, this time from the new level of the course, the one for grade 7. Okay? Take a look at this sample text. I'm sure if I only just showed you this text, you would probably overlook the internal organization of this text from the perspective of micro-recycling. But thanks to Tomek, I am able to show you what the insides are like. Okay? So take a text like this and look underneath. This is what you find. Okay? Rather amazing, isn't it? Okay, now what's the color coding? Well, the green words are the ones that belong to the first vocabulary set. Okay? The red bits are the target grammar for this unit. Okay? The yellow highlights around some other words. Well, this is the second vocabulary set in this unit, you see? And finally, there's a little bit of purple as well, which is the vocabulary taken from the speaking section that the editor and the author want the student to encounter one more time, you see? It's a completely systematic process of exposing the learner over and over again to the target vocabulary because they deserve to be given this in order for the brain to decide it's useful and not to be pruned. Okay? So, multiplicity of exposures, mission number 1, and the second mission, this. So exposures must be multiple, and I hope you've already discovered what the next word is going to be. And surprise, surprise, it has got the letter R in it. Have you guessed? Well, I hope you have. That's the word varied, yes, or variety, if you like. So, we need variety. Why do we need variety? Well, because brains are different. Marysha's brain is probably different from Wojtusz's brain. I mean, certainly different from Wojtusz's brain because it's 2 different brains, right? But effectively, every single brain is a little unique, right? It's slightly unique. It's slightly different from every other brain. And what does this tell us about a design of a course and a design of a lesson? Well, of course, given that the brains are so varied, some of these brains may respond well to reading or listening, okay, and extracting linguistic information from a piece of text, spoken or written. There may be other brains which just love doing things with the language, processing the language for meaning, maybe even scribbling something in a notebook, not in the book, because it's disallowed, but in a notebook, okay? And there may be a third kind of brain, perhaps, the one which just loves grammar tables. I'm a brain like this. When I was a student, I loved order. I loved organization. It was very pleasing for me to actually see that kind of pattern emerging, okay? And there may be yet another brain for whom the only way to really, really get something to get lifted from underneath the surface is to make it humorous and thus truly memorable. I'll give you an example of what this kind of brain might really benefit from.
Wow, Jack, that's cool. I'm not so sporty.
Yeah, maybe. But you are clever. Look, it's Emma. She's beautiful.
What? She is not beautiful. She's my sister.
Hi, Emma.
Ryan, you aren't serious. You're late for dinner.
And she isn't friendly.
Look, it's Mum and Dad. They are not happy.
Hey, Emma, look at me.
He isn't clever.
Yeah, but he's funny.
I am sporty. I am not sporty. I'm not sporty. She is friendly. She is not friendly. She isn't friendly. They are happy. They are not happy. They aren't happy. He is clever. He is not clever. He isn't clever.
Right. Good stuff, isn't it? I hope you've noticed that this animation certainly reintroduces the same target vocabulary set. And you have got 2 such animations per unit in Brainy for the 2 target vocabulary sets. Variety, okay? Now, variety is not an optional extra. This is what we've learned from this modern science of the brain. And to illustrate this to you, I have something rather wonderful, and as you can see, it's real. It's a project that a colleague of ours, a real teacher, Ania Bogumił, has done with her students. A project where they were invited to each decide what it is that they really liked about the course that they happened to be working with. Why is this interesting? Well, it is interesting because it gives them a chance to decide which of the study techniques is preferable for their own brain. And you know what they said? Look, one of them, clearly one of those who just love to do things with the language, play games with the language, do rapping, sing songs, etc. One brain. Another brain, same classroom, a kind of Marysia brain, if you like, or maybe Grzegorz brain, a brain that loves organization and order. And a third brain, I'm sure that Tomek and the author of the course love this kind of student. You see, he or she is telling us almost verbatim that he or she needs multiple exposure in a number of varied ways. Okay? And in case you are thinking, I'm just trying to highlight one single project, well, no, because you see, I am aware, amongst others, of this principle of retention. The principle of retention through decision-taking, conscious decision-taking. I've taken this from a wonderful book, one which is a little sad as regards the title, but certainly not sad when it comes to its message. And here, as you can see, the message is very clear. Thinking about something consciously is one way to help the brain retain it. So how could we implement this behind classroom doors? Well, with a wonderful book like Brainy, one way would be to always get a student to choose something, take a decision. For instance, present the student with 2 different grammar projects at the end of a unit. And the student, as you can see, has a chance to actively decide whether, perhaps being more Marysia-like, they would rather do a grammar poster, or if they are somebody else, maybe they will prefer to write a short entry for a blog. Again, in Brainy, this is not a one-off. Every unit culminates with this kind of choice for the target grammar in this unit. Because you see, and this is going to be yet another rebus wordplay for this session, okay? This is what brain is like. Anybody's brain, okay? It's a bit of a wordplay for you. I hope you've already discovered. So what is the brain like? Well, the brain is, of course, selfish, okay? What does this mean? It means that if the brain is to decide something is useful, it must be useful for this very brain. It must be relevant, another R word, to this brain, okay? How do we achieve that? Well, I've already showed you a number of design features of this course that will certainly contribute. Let me show you, however, a sort of accompanying idea, one that I've lifted from a wonderful book by Nick Bilbrough called Memory Activities for Language Learning. It's a very simple activity. You can use any target vocabulary set for it. So let's revisit ours, shall we? The 8 words that you already know. What the student does is he or she takes a little dictation. You choose, in this case, 5 items at random from the target vocabulary set. The student needs to write things down, but, and crucially, not these words. So what does the student write instead? Well, instead, for each of the word you give them, they need to think of a person with this feature, in our case, okay? So let me give you an example. If I said sporty, then what you could write for number 1 is Lewandowski, okay? And so on. It could be a famous person, it could be a friend, but somebody who really means something to that person. And, after the 5 names have been written down, okay, you ask them at random, what is the adjective for number 4? What is the adjective for number 1? What is the adjective for number 3? And so on. And you see, it's wonderful because instead of just regurgitating the original words in a rote-like drill manner, okay, the brains have got a chance to think in terms of relevance, right? So Lewandowski is sporty for me, and my great friend Marysia is helpful, etc., etc., etc. Because, of course, yet another way of sort of thinking in terms of why would I remember anything at all is because it is personally, what? Personally relevant to me, okay? So at this point, you may as well just make a huge mental note for yourself, which is that if you are indeed using, as I hope you are, a lot of personalization activities in your own teaching, do this even more, because it's absolutely fundamental from the perspective of micro recycling and long-term retention, okay? Now, to throw a few extra ideas before we finish, one place where this sort of micro recycling potentially naturally takes place is the student's own notebook, is it not? And it's sort of sad that a lot of these notebooks basically look as if nobody gives another thought for how the words and other things are being recorded in those notebooks. So what I would like to suggest to you is this is a fantastic testing ground for micro-recycling and giving the student tools for long-term retention. Let me give you a few examples. First, beginning with sort of 4th-grader-like type of vocabulary. So imagine, for instance, you are recording colors. Well, of course, we could say red, czerwony, blue, niebieski, green, zielony. But isn't it nicer and easier on the brain to simply record colors with colors? One added value of this kind of recording strategy is that, of course, the page that codes colors will look different from any other page in this student's notebook. Of course, it's not just colors, it's a relatively familiar example, but look at this. Thick versus thin, okay? I've so far just written 2 words, but if the word thick were actually written in thick font and the word thin were written in thin font in the notebook, wouldn't that immediately communicate the meaning? And of course, it's not just thick and thin, it could be big or large versus small or tiny. It could be round, you know, written like this, versus straight, written like this, and wavy, written like this, you see? And so on and so forth. And when students get slightly older, well, maybe they will be able to personalize words like increase. Do I have to translate this word any longer? Surely not. And I'm guessing that in your own brain, unless it's very, very weird, the opposite of increase has already taken visual shape, hasn't it? Decrease. Okay? I'll show you another example to persuade you that this technique is absolutely applicable, not just to physical, words coding physical features, but also to abstract words, nouns, verbs, etc. Look at this one. It's amazing, isn't it? Isolate. When you see isolate, you will remember what it means forever. Okay? Likewise, and I'm sure your brains are working already, think about the word connect. How would you represent connect from this perspective? Well, clearly the letters would now need to really latch onto one another. And a word like overlap, a much more advanced word. Okay, is this possible with overlap? Well, of course it is, right? The letters would literally overlap one another. Okay? Now, this idea is really a very strong universal idea, so much so that Tomek Sztyber, the one who you already met, Tomek, who went to one of those training sessions of mine where I showed those memory techniques, he said, you know what, I'm going to insert at least 1 or 2 examples in Brainy because I am confident that this is a technique that a student deserves to know. So as you can see, a word like, in this case, Walt, tape stick, well, why not, or sticky tape, why not have this word look like the object that it actually codes? So I hope you can see that given the student enough support and training, you can get the brain to process words like this, no matter what target vocabulary set you happen to be working on. And again, imagine the student is getting a bit older and maybe needs a few extra techniques. Well, here is one. Isn't it lovely? It's based on an otherwise quite inspiring book for language teachers, even though it probably wasn't written with a language teacher in mind, the book called Wreck This Journal, or Zniszcz ten dziennik if you happen to be using the Polish edition. And a lot of the ideas on pages of this book seem quite wacky, but look, take a word whose spelling always escapes you, like the word queue. Right? One way to help your own brain decide that the spelling of Q is really important is to micro-recycle it. How would you micro-recycle it here? Well, by filling a page, however you choose, with instances of the word Q. I'll give you yet another example. One of my favorite, in fact. An example which clearly would have to be a unit after unit project. Would it not? I mean, there would not be enough 5-letter words in a single unit, which means that imagine at the back of their notebook, a student starts a page like this and gradually adds words as he or she reviews the vocabulary from subsequent units. And at the same time goes back and revisits the vocabulary that they already recorded 1, 2, 3 units ago. Okay? Micro-recycling in the student's own hands. And this brings me, at long last, to a close of this session. And before I finish, if you've bought this methodology of micro-recycling, I hope you will enjoy my final activity, my friendly reminder about what the key methodology is. Remember, this is how we opened, right? With a reference to Sesame Street and with a letter of the day, okay? Now, what I would like you to do is pause this recording and try and think of as many different words that are relevant to our message today, to our methodology, that contain the letter R, and write them down. I'm curious how many you're able to come up with. I'll just give you an example, but please do not go to my next slide until you have paused the recording and given yourselves a chance. These are the words that I'm sure are not the totality of the R words in this session, but I think they represent a nice enough sample. Take a look. Some of these words start with the letter R. Some of these words contain the letter R somewhere along the way, and some of them end with the letter R. If you're looking at the words now, I hope you've noticed a daring and glaring omission, which of course is the word micro-recycling, right? The key term for today. Okay, so this is what I want to finish with and remind you. You see, brainy and friendly, this is how we started, right? So what I am doing throughout today is I'm showing you how I am also micro-recycling my message throughout this session. Why? Because I am hoping that by doing so, I will give your brain more of a chance to take in and retain this message for longer. If so, I hope that I've done my job well for today. Thank you very much for listening, and good luck with your students and their long-term remembering.